I remember so clearly we were going like down the spiral staircase and we were passing these big stone walls. And I thought, wow, people have died in here. And that's when I really started getting this sense of history being embedded into the walls of spaces. So, all of this to say that as we're designing theater spaces, every little detail that you put on stage evokes an imagination. Everything becomes specific.
Welcome. You're listening to In Depth Talks Design Inquiry, a segment to celebrate blooming artists and bold practices that are turning the art and design scene on its head. Today, we're in conversation with William Boles, currently a student at Harvard Graduate School of Design with an impressive practice as a theater and set designer. Scaling the confluence of landscape architecture, theater design, culture, and social practice, William speaks to us about space, the crafts of mise en scène, breaking the fourth wall, and much more. Stay tuned. Hello, William. Thank you for joining me today. It is a joy to have you on. Without any delays, I'll get the ball rolling with asking you something fairly straightforward. What is going on for you at work and in general? What is keeping you busy, excited, or even entertained?
Uh, um, well, I'm in my final year of grad school studying landscape architecture. So, um, classwork is keeping me busy at the moment. Um, Learning about different plants, learning about wildfire. Um, it's a pretty all-consuming experience right now. So that's kind of my main focus.
Okay, and thank you for sending me the link to your webpage, Theatre and Nature. To all those who are listening, please find a link to William's work in the description box. Your website hosted some incredible work on the intersections of landscape architecture, set design, music, and even play. But before we dig into the deeper questions, maybe we can start with how this confluence of landscape architecture, theater come about for you.
Yeah, well, I first started doing theater when I was in middle school. I grew up in a small town, actually in Indiana, and then I moved to Florida when I was 11, a town called Lakeland, Florida, and began getting involved in a community theater, late middle school. And then in high school, I went to Performing Arts High School, where I focused on theater, musical theater in particular. And then as I went to college, I became very interested in set design, actually towards the later end of high school, and basically just took a leap to explore it in college and fell in love with it. And yeah, after that, I took um, basically 6 months off to do an internship in Seattle at
Mm.
Seattle Repertory Theater um, to learn about scenic painting. Um, and through that experience, I'd always wanted to go to Seattle, especially coming from Florida. I mean, I pretty much went as far away as I could from Florida, on the continental United States. Um, but Seattle was a very interesting experience, and through that experience, I learned that I didn't want to be a scenic painter in particular. I love scenic painting. It can be a really fun experience in particular because of the scale of the work. Um, but for me, I really learned that I love the process of composition and
Mm.
composing ideas. That's really one of the most joyful parts of the process for me. And so from that, I decided to pursue a master's program in set design and ended up going to Northwestern University in Chicago, and studying under some amazing set design teachers. Um, some of them, Todd Rosenthal, Walt Spangler, and of course, as I'm saying this, their names are leaving me. But Dan Osling was an incredible set design teacher. Three very different aesthetics from super realism to minimalism to fantastic, um, kind of fantastic expressionism.
Which one of
And
these, I'm sorry
uh,
to cut you in, which one of these captured your imagination the most?
well, I first was very interested in the minimalism of Dan Osling. I think for myself, oh, so Dan Osling is a set designer, and his I was really fascinated with how he could communicate so little, so much with so little.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And that seemed like a big challenge that I wanted to learn from. So I got in touch with him through the program and was eventually able to meet another one of my mentors, Todd Rosenthal, amazing set designer. And his work in particular focuses on realism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all three of those set designers yeah, really capture magical realism, which is very much what I'm interested in. Where you can take something like a realistic kitchen and then it explodes into some type of surreal dream. So I did my MFA in set design, learned a ton, and then I stayed in Chicago for 11 years. I was based in Chicago and worked around the country, a little internationally, and 90% of the stories that I would work on are new stories. So that was working directly with playwrights. So through that experience, I was able to really immerse myself in new play development,
Mm-hmm.
new story development, and writing, and learning uh, the articulation of different voices. And about halfway through that time, I went to the High Line in New York City. This was halfway through my time out of grad school for set design. And have you been to the High Line?
I haven't. I haven't been to New York either.
When you go to New York, I recommend going to the High Line. It's a really interesting space because it used to be um, a train that ran through Chelsea in the meatpacking district, and eventually was abandoned. And
Okay.
through a process of grassroots campaigning, they were able
Uh-huh.
to turn it into an elevated park. So it's this raised train track that's been turned
Right.
into basically these meadows that run along the top of it.
So
And
like a public space,
it's a
repurposed
public
into
space,
public
yes,
space.
public park.
Mm-hmm.
And um, it captured my attention because it was amazing to see something old be made new. It was amazing to see people transported into this quieter space from the noise of the street.
Mm.
And it also was amazing to me because it was inherently theatrical in how it framed the
Right.
city. So as you're moving through Chelsea, someone's window with a cup in on the sill or
Yeah.
something, it becomes art basically. So it felt like theater to me. So that's when I learned about landscape architecture. And for the several years after that, I still kept being interested in landscape architecture.
Mm.
Um, from the very beginning of my work out of grad school, I started exploring with natural elements in my sets.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the first one actually was this play called The Amish Project at a theater company called American Theater Company in Chicago. It's no longer open, but it's a story of um, a shooting that happened in an Amish school, and it takes place in Pennsylvania. But that theater had kind of its own aesthetic in terms of it was in this historic industrial post office where the horses used to be held in a
Okay.
neighborhood in Chicago.
So like a
And
stable.
yeah, it was very raw, exposed bricks, big industrial windows.
Uh-huh.
Um, the audience seating had been put into this open space, could be
Mm.
repositioned. And so that set, we ended up creating these corn stalks that were referencing the fields in Pennsylvania, and then also had this meadow that moved through the space. And it's a one-woman show where she's dressed in um, Amish garb, but she plays all the different characters from the school teachers to the children that are shot, to the postman who actually comes
Hmm.
um, and does the event. But all this to say that the pandemic was really the moment of change of my
Hmm.
course because the theater industry ended up shutting down.
Yeah.
And I started really thinking, how do I get involved in landscape architecture? And interviewed some different people who were in the field and eventually learned, oh, I kind of have to go back to school to enter the field.
Hmm.
Um, so that's when I ended up exploring that.
I'm also quite fascinated by the title of your webpage, Theater and Nature. So, in a way that what kind of play goes on in the positioning of these words, as in theater is or as nature, or nature is or as theater,
Mm.
because there's something very natural about theater and very something very theatrical about nature as well. So, what was the thought process behind naming your work or body of work with that title? Yeah. So, are the two connotations mutually interchangeable for you?
I used to think so because working in theater, you go into the black box and you are basically removed from nature. So I used to think that they were very separate. And one of the reasons that I wanted to begin to explore landscape architecture is because I wanted to return to nature, the nature that I experienced as a child growing up on a farm
Mm.
in Indiana, where
Ah.
I would spend a ton of time as a child roaming around the farm and in the woods through the corn stalks, um, in the barn with the bales of hay, and just spent so much time exploring all that. So I'd spent so much time as a freelance set designer going from theater to theater, dark space to
Mm.
dark space, and it's it's it can be really fun, but that also can be kind of a lonely and sometimes depressing experience. So I did have this desire to go back out in nature. And since I've been in school studying landscape architecture, I've really learned that theater and nature, they actually are very intertwined. And nature is very theatrical. And the
Mm.
story that it tells through, say, for example, a plant trying to attract a species of
Mm.
um, bee or, some type of insect, there's a whole um, story of romance and
Yeah.
there that's oh yeah, and the season will change so much theater.
Right. So, in that context, if I give you three words, which is site, stage, and landscape, in your interdisciplinary explorations, do you view or approach these as separate entities? And if so, in what ways? Or are there any grounds for them to collapse into one another?
That's a really interesting question. Site, stage, and landscape. I think that they can be separate experiences, and
Mm-hmm.
especially as you're designing, I find that I'm thinking about them separately, and then the convergence of them is the catharsis, which to me
Uh-huh.
is the goal. That happens eventually in the hour and a half period of time that you're in a theater, or you can have that experience when you're walking through a park, kind of like I had when I was walking in the High Line, and I just had this kind of emotional romantic experience that was evoked through the environment.
Yeah, walking can do that, right? You're sort of engaging directly with everything that is around you, but it's also constantly changing as your body moves its position with respect to space. It's really fascinating. Which also brings me back to the stage as a space. One can say that it is like a place which is embedded within another space, which could be like an auditorium or theater or even an open space. So the
Mm,
stage is essentially a microcosm, if you will.
mm,
So it could be the market scene of a medieval French village in present day London, or it could be any context embedded in an entirely different context. In so speaking, the nesting sort of creates a bubble around this set, almost defining an invisible fourth wall.
Mm.
Have there been any instances where the demand of the play has required a blending or rupture or something unusual with this membrane or the so-called fourth wall? And how do designers then approach such a brief?
That's another great question. I find that the fourth wall is an element of design, and it at some point desires to be broken, and it has its own aesthetic as well. For example, like when I was working at American Theater Company, there was a director I worked with named Will Davis, and we worked on a play, We're Gonna Be Okay. Through that experience, I learned about the decision but basically the way that the theater looks when you walk into it, the masking in particular, or if the theater is exposed, is a part of the design. And it starts creating these rules of authenticity. And you start considering what's real, what's not real.
Hmm.
And my goal often as a designer is to set those rules and then eventually break them. And so it creates this kind of psychological warping, which to me, it becomes a spiritual experience at that point. Um,
Hmm.
and I kind of see the theater as a portal.
As a portal. So, in that respect, allow me to bring into this conversation Juhani Palasma, who is a fantastic architect, writer, and theorist. Are you familiar with his work?
I'm actually not.
He has written several books, and one of the books that I have with me today, where his conversation is featured with Ela and Louise Lemoine, the incredible filmmakers. They have curated 12 conversations with seasoned architects, and one of them is Juhani Palasma. And he writes extensively about space, experience, the position of body, embodied experiences. And I'm quoting him directly. He says something like, when you enter a space, the space enters you. And
Mm,
I think this holds true for both architectural design and theater production. As a theater designer, how do you encourage this engagement? Are there any challenges? And what kinds of engagements and challenges do you have to cope with? And also, tabula rasas, blank slates. Is there no
mm,
such thing? In the Amish play, you mentioned a stable was reimagined to serve the context of the play. So, in that case, it wasn't really a blank slate. So, how does this
mm,
management of space for a very curated experience come about?
mm. I do think that every space has evokes this type of feeling. And for me, it kind of goes back to this original experience that I had in fourth grade, where my her name was Miss Pulowski, an art teacher, and I was living in this small town in Indiana. Um, she she chose some of the students who seemed kind of, I think, extra interested in art, and had us enter this competition to build a model replica of a historic building in the town. And
Okay.
so my group was assigned this historic jail. I think it was like pre-Civil War.
Uh,
And we ended up going to visit the jail. And the design of the jail, it was a cylinder internal shape and multi-level where
okay.
the cells were. So each floor had one door, and each cell had one door. So you could only exit when your door came to that one door
Hmm.
on the level. And because of that, many people would die from fires. And I remember so clearly we were going like down the spiral staircase and we were passing these big stone walls. And I thought, wow, people have died in here. And that's when I really started getting this sense of history being embedded into the walls of spaces. So all of this to say that as we're designing theater spaces, every little detail that you put on stage evokes an imagination. Everything becomes specific.
I'm quite fascinated by the anecdote of this prison because it kind of holds a lot of negative experience, like you mentioned, death, and also the experience of confinement in a way.
Hmm.
So in the case of your exploration, what form did this building take in your project?
We ended up making an exact replica of it in miniature. So
Okay,
we weren't creating a type of expression of it, like you could say a set design. This was an exact unit, like replica. It's scaled down,
I see. Hmm.
but it was the feeling that I felt through kind of creating that replica kind of came through that for me made me fascinated with spaces and the history that they hold.
Yeah, it is. It becomes a method of documentation. It is actually a very good point of exploration, especially in education, which kind of brings me to ask you that how does your education feed into the practice as a set designer or theater maker? Are there any direct correlations, or do you break away from your education and try to look
Mm.
for avenues to expand beyond?
Think there's it's a paradox because for me, I've been really lucky to have amazing teachers throughout my life,
Hmm.
in various different aspects. But then there comes a point where you can no longer be your teachers and you have to be yourself and you have to create from a space of personal belief. And I didn't really start getting to that place until around 2019,
Hmm.
where I really started feeling like pulling myself away from comparing myself to my teachers and recognizing that the way that I'm going to create something has to be okay and it has to be satisfying to me. And from that point on, my work, I felt like it started changing. And I started believing in it more. And I could feel that energy in my collaborations in a different way.
Right. And what other sites offered you inspiration or some kind of ideas to work with? Meaning that it's not just education, but also various events or cultural practices or social
Mm.
practices that kind of feed into the creative work of practitioners.
Mm.
So, in that case, what would be those elements that have inspired your work?
Mm. Um, I'm really inspired by underground queer spaces, in particular, gay bars. Um, I I mean, I personally am gay. Um, I did grow up in a pretty religious environment,
Mm,
especially through college, and went through a process of, um, believing Jesus saved me from being gay. And it was a pretty challenging time. And I eventually, came to accept this aspect of myself. And what I've come to is that those spaces that I felt really afraid of in earlier parts of my life and misunderstood, like I didn't have an understanding of them, I now see them as sacred spaces.
mhm.
And
How so?
sacred spaces in the sense that when you look at queer history and the underground aspect of it and people being kind of pushed underground to express themselves
Mm,
through bars or bathrooms or woods or um, it's a whole culture that's been created. And even though there are people in society who don't understand it and who shame it, there's something incredibly beautiful about it. And I learned a term recently called collective effervescence. Comes from
okay,
a French,
what's
yeah, collective effervescence. It comes from a French, let me find this real fast. Um,
that is also a new word for me.
yeah, it
Collective
was
effervescence.
a new word for me. Um, okay, so collective effervescence is a sociological concept introduced by Emile Durkheim a French writer, and it's describing an intense feeling of awe and emotional connection experienced when a group of people share a common purpose or participate in a synchronous activity. So I think that we definitely can see that in the theater, collective effervescence. I can feel that, when I go to a gay bar,
Mm.
um, the spirit of that. Um, and I also can feel that in experiences of landscape architecture in a way that's different than nature. I feel like nature is a bit more of an individual experience with the larger whole, but
Mm.
then landscape architecture is particularly social.
Speaking of social, and because very recently we celebrated Dasera, so Dasera is a Hindu festivity. Are you familiar with Dasera?
I'm not.
Okay. So Dasera is celebrated widely in parts of India by the Hindu community to commemorate the return of Lord Ram, who's an important deity in Hindu religious practices, to his kingdom of Ayodhya, which was also based in northern parts of India. So the story goes something like this, and I'm cutting around the corners. That Lord Ram was exiled from the kingdom of Ayodhya. We'll not get into the reasons. Along with his wife and brother Lakshman, he roamed different parts of India for a period of 13 years, I believe. And in the last year of their exile, goddess Sita was kidnapped by the demon king Ravan, whose kingdom was based in then Sri Lanka. And the last year of this exile is marked by Lord Ram's search for his wife Sita, Sita's time in Ravan's captivity, and it concludes with Lord Ram finally making his way from the southern tip of India to Sri Lanka, rescuing his wife, fighting a long, hard battle with Ravan, and defeating him, and finally returning to his kingdom of Ayodhya. So essentially, this particular premise marks the plot of Ram Leela, which is performed by people in different parts of India, and it is also very widely watched. And it has been watched for years, years and years altogether. But in this case, in the case of Dasera and Ram Leela, play becomes a point of celebration, a point of commemorialization and religious gathering. Is there a similar opportunity for a religious event to be transformed into a play and celebrated in the West? Not necessarily like this. It needn't have a very archetypal storyline with a protagonist and antagonist, but something of social and religious significance that becomes a part of annual celebrations.
Yeah, I mean, the story that comes to mind is the Christian story of Jesus. It's
Hmm.
kind of told through more of a national perspective a little bit. Um, there's very much this idea of Jesus as the hero.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and you see that celebrated through many different, religious expressions, performances. So
Hmm.
I would, that's what comes to mind is the the first kind of Western
Right.
expression of that story.
But also the thing is that with several years, we've also seen these plays evolving in their storytelling and their narratives to include other diverse characters and other diverse viewpoints. So in that case, have you ever worked on a play that is sort of marked as an evolution from its
Mm,
original version?
these are such great questions. Actually, what comes to mind is Shakespeare. And the story of the Tempest came to mind as you were explaining that plot. Often in theaters, you'll see new adaptations of Shakespeare stories in more contemporary lens. Um, yeah, so I could see Shakespeare being a frame for recreating an older story into a new translation.
To
And
include more. diverse viewpoints and characters.
Exactly. Yeah. And I see that a lot in different theaters throughout America.
In that case, referencing also plays a very important role in this respect. Oftentimes, in creative practices, a lot of thought goes into journaling, into documentation, into research of characters, of plot lines, of scripts and stories. And many a times, creative professionals leave sort of Easter eggs or references in their work, which sort of creates a space for indirect communication with audiences or people who are enthusiastic to learn more. So, in that case, what kind of objects or references serve as opportunities for you while you're designing to have that sort of communication with your guests or audiences?
Well, as certain productions are being created, often an audience will be very specific, regionally. Once you kind of get to Broadway, it becomes a little bit more, um, I don't know if I should say universal, but in some productions, there could be a very specific reference to a community that that story is being performed for. I would say that's a bit more of a rare situation, and that has to do with a creation of a new story, new production.
Mm,
Um, but I have worked on plays where, as I've been doing research on the environment and knowing perhaps who could be coming to the show, I'll put specific details into the set to help create some excitement for their
mm.
experience.
Could you give us any instances or examples of having done that?
Yes, there was a play that I worked on with About Face Theater in Chicago. Um, the name of the play is leaving my mind, unfortunately, because as you're doing a lot of these plays, the the names kind of eventually leave after a few years. But this story was about a women's college, and I knew that some of the students of that school would be coming to see the performance. So it was a fun opportunity to incorporate familiar architecture into the set that they would recognize. And it would automatically create a sense of inclusion.
That's great. One other thread that I wanted to tug on was the aspect of body when it comes to positioning it in space. And it could be an architectural space or a theater production or a stage. The body becomes both a site and a medium of spatial experience. In architecture, the body employs its senses through hearing, touch, light to get a sense of space with respect to its position in the space. That same thing could be said about stage as well. So, how do designers exploit this opportunity of using body's positionality in the form of its audience's bodies or performers' bodies in kind of extrapolating that experience to something beyond?
I'd say that that's a huge and one of the most important aspects of designing space in theater. The relationship between the actors and the audience is key because within that distance, there's a spatial dynamic, and every inch is literally energetic.
Yeah.
And to me, that's one of the most fun aspects of composition. Um, Moving something over just a little bit closer to something else or farther away from something else
Hmm.
create this emotional experience. So the way that the audience is positioned could be like we see traditionally with a proscenium theater, with the audience in front, with the actors in front, and it creates a very objective experience. We also have the alley arrangement where the audience is on the sides
Yeah.
and actors are along the center area. And
Yes.
that creates more of an experience, almost like a mirror, because the audience is seeing the other audience through the
Mm.
actors. And so that creates more of an experience of immersion. And there are certain stories where that can be. really interesting. Um, there are, the way that you position an audience in relationship to the actors creates a whole mental diagram, basically. Um, I like to take a kind of traditional pieces, for example, um, say My Fair Lady, the musical,
Mm,
which is very much kind of like old classic Broadway house where you have a proscenium and a stage in front. Um, I really love to reimagine those stories into more dimensional experiences, um, which could look like it's in an alley of an old industrial space,
mm,
um, or in the round, where it becomes especially this sense of being connected to a larger whole. And also through that experience, it creates this depth of character in a different way than just looking at a physical body and seeing a background. Um, in those experiences where the audience is positioned in alley or in the round, often that could lead to less scenery.
mm.
But less scenery kind of opens up the opportunity to be more specific. Um,
Yeah, so in this case, this relationship of the positioning of the audience and the performers, is it, in your experience, is it driven more by the site or the demand of the plot, or is it kind of like a negotiation between the two?
I think it's a negotiation,
Hmm.
because it could go in any direction, really. You could tell a story in any different way. I don't really think that there's a right or wrong. I think that there's a more interesting sometimes. Um, and that negotiation in particular happens with the director.
Right.
Because the director is in particular leading the whole experience.
You expressed before how composition is very exciting as an element to you because the composition drives whether the setting of the play is in harmony or discord. And it is this aspect of specificity in the setting of theater that excites you the most. But what if, in some contexts, this specificity is not necessarily required and the demand is to be more loose and flexible? How do you approach or view that
Hmm. You're talking about in terms of the environment.
in terms of the environment and also the setting of the play?
Usually when a production is more abstract in its environmental surround, it creates an opportunity for specificity with the characters.
Hmm.
And alternative to that could be a super specific, say, realistic environment that probably also has super specific characters. But um, I always try with my sets to help them sit secondary to the experience so that the characters are what we're really focusing on. So it's a balance that we're trying to achieve of focus with the design. And that has to do with the scenic environment, the characters through their clothing that they're wearing, because every piece of clothing tells a specific experience. And then lighting, how the lighting is moving through that. So ideally they are all working.
Right. Which brings me to ask you the next question. Is there any project that you're currently working on?
Right now, I've been working on a project called Love Futura, a phantasmagoric Americana, which is a project that is focused on creating spaces in America where people feel safe. And I realize that's a really broad, open topic. And part of the investigation of the project is that you can never say what makes another person feel safe
That's
because
right.
we all have our own experience. So it creates this open conversation about people sharing their experiences. Um, and yeah, it's an evolving process. I came to school to learn the skills to manifest this vision through public space, in particular through landscape architecture. And the dream of it is that it's a blurring of theatrical space and nature through public space.
I'm actually curious to know what the play Love Futura is about and how what you just said ties into it all.
Love Futura comes from this idea, um, what does love look like in the future?
Hmm.
And to me, love looks like the same thing that it looks like right now. So it leads to the question of what is love, which is also tied to one of the reasons that I really admire Shakespeare because his work was, in my opinion, really exploring all the different expressions of love. Um, Part of this project also is um, ultimately in the future, I'm working towards having a studio with my sister. Works in architecture, and the dream is that we merge our studios.
Ah,
And
and just the right opportunity for that.
yes, and so the term Love Futura comes from I was talking with her, and I was talking about um, we, it was basically the font was Futura,
Aha, I
and
see.
and I said I love Futura. So that's an example of the kind of experience that I try to incorporate into my work, where I am very interested in poetry and
Hmm.
words. I think particularly because my experience in theater and text and scripts, and I also do really love writing. And each of these parks, there are 12 parks that are imagined through this project, are framed through a poem that references particular figures um, in those communities. And I use this technique called the cut up technique that has roots back to Dadaism and Surrealism, but was in particular used by William Burroughs in like the 50s and 60s, where um, he would find text, cut it up into different
Yeah,
ways, and then
I'm
rearrange it,
familiar.
and then a new voice comes through. So the work that I do with these parks, it is a bit of a collage where um, rather than my own words, I pull text from various figures um, and rearrange it and let a manifesto emerge through that. It's very much being evolved, um, but it does bring me a lot of joy. And I came back to school to learn the skills how to make this happen.
It sounds like an exciting project to me, William, and thank you so much for sharing that. Before we wrap up today's episode, I was wondering if you could throw some light on what you think is the future of this field, and especially that you have very courageously navigated this intersection of landscape architecture play with some really interesting viewpoints. Where do you see it headed in the future?
The work that I'm interested in, particularly.
Yes, in regards to the field at large.
Gotcha. Um, one of the things in my experience is that I was a PBS kid, public broadcasting in America, partly because growing up we didn't have cable, and so PBS was kind of like my main source of entertainment. But also, I think through those, you know, productions that I watched on there, it exposed me to the idea of democracy and education.
Hmm.
And so the work that I'm really interested in contributing to the field of landscape architecture is a blurring of theater and nature through a celebration of imagination. And that can look in many different ways, um, through engaging communities,
Hmm.
through creating experiences that people have a hard time forgetting, creating beautiful objects, um, writing books that help people understand their relationship to nature in new ways. Um, all this to say that the reason that I really wanted to sh take a shift in my career is because I'm super inspired by the remediate, well, the ability that nature has to self-heal. You can see that through different types of relationships in the ecosystem. And I think that presenting these stories to communities um, could bring positive change into the world.
Is it also the driving thought behind future parks?
It is. So the idea of Future Parks, a studio that I founded in 2020, it is this idea of parks in the near future. Um, so these these ideas are being developed, and they're just like 5 years away, basically. So um, part of it too is, what does it mean? What does Future Parks mean? It's a bit of a conundrum, a confusion, um,
Hmm.
which kind of taps back into this idea of um, emotional catharsis, a messiness that can happen within the theater,
Yeah,
um, but also in nature, um, and ultimately creating experiences of connection and beauty.
that sounds like a fantastic and promising venture to me, and I wish you the very best. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And that is all for our chat today. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe to us on Spotify and follow on Instagram for updates. Thank you for listening.
I find that the fourth wall is an element of design, and it at some point desires to be broken, and it has its own aesthetic as well.